Today's episode of Off the Timeline is titled Iowa Didn't Choose Chaos. Chaos Chose Iowa. What if, in November of 2010, Iowa made a decision that didn't look radical at the time? They forced out Kirk Ferentz quietly, carefully, and they told themselves it was about control. What they didn't know yet was that this single move would eventually pull Iowa out of the Big Ten, into the Big 12, and finally into the SEC without ever trying to become a villain. This is the story of how Iowa didn't chase power, they chased certainty. But first, we need to set the table. By 2010, Iowa football was still winning, not dominating, not collapsing, just holding. But under the surface, everything felt unstable. Off field issues were piling up. The Big Ten was openly discussing expansion, and Iowa quietly realized it might not matter how well run they were if the conference moved without them in mind. This wasn't about Ferentz, the coach. This was about Iowa, the institution, looking at a sport that was about to accelerate and realizing stability was no longer guaranteed. So Iowa did something very uncomfortable. They didn't wait for collapse. They didn't wait for disaster. They reset early. Ferentz was eased out under the language of quote unquote program refresh, the kind of phrase schools use when they're afraid of the future but don't want to admit it. At the time, this felt conservative. In hindsight, it was the most dangerous move Iowa could make. Iowa's next decision is where this universe bends. They didn't hire nostalgia. They didn't hire Midwest familiarity. They hired Dan Mullen. At the time, Mullen was seen as a modern offensive mind, SEC tested, flexible enough to adapt without destroying the culture. Iowa sold it as an evolution, but internally, this was an admission. The old version of Iowa may not survive what's coming. The conference gamble. This was the move that nobody expected. As the Big Ten hesitated, slow, cautious, inward, Iowa stopped waiting. In 2011, Iowa announced it was leaving the Big Ten for the Big 12. The justification sounded very reasonable. Regional rivalries, competitive balance, avoiding over-centralization. But the real reason was simpler. Iowa didn't want to be middle class in a conference racing towards superpower economics. This wasn't greed, it was fear of irrelevance. First season, 2011. The results were messy and that mattered. Iowa goes 8-5 in year one under Mullen. They have a faster offense, looser defense, and their identity is still forming. They upset Texas at home, they lose badly to Oklahoma, they drop a strange road game they probably shouldn't have. And that was perfect, because nothing locks a universe in like plausible discomfort. Iowa wasn't broken, but they weren't Iowa anymore either. And every era needs a human anchor. For Mullins, Iowa, in this universe, they pulled a quarterback named Evan Caldwell, who was a four-star dual threat from Missouri. Overlooked by Ohio State, flipped late after Iowa's Big 12 move. Caldwell doesn't choose Iowa despite the chaos. He chooses Iowa because of it. By 2014, he's thrown for 3,100 passing yards, 800 rushing yards, and for the first time, Iowa wasn't selling safety. They were selling possibility. And then in 2014, they flirt with the SEC. And this is a year that nobody really talks about. Behind closed doors, the SEC starts watching Iowa closely, not as a brand grab, but as infrastructure. At this stage, Iowa recruits SEC linemen, plays disciplined physical football, travels well, doesn't embarrass the league. Iowa listens, but they don't jump, and that restraint is what makes the next move inevitable. For, for a decade, the Big 10 and Big 12 are in a quiet, cold battle. Then Texas and Oklahoma turned up the stakes. In 2021, the sport stopped pretending stability mattered. Suddenly, Iowa's early moves didn't look chaotic. They looked early, which leads us to the SEC move. In 2022, Iowa accepts an SEC invitation, paired with Kansas State. no fireworks, no speeches, just access. Iowa didn't join the SEC to dominate. They joined to never be excluded again. And that takes us to the playoff peak, which for Iowa comes in 2024 as part of the 12-team era. In that year, they go 10-2. They earn a 9 seed. They beat Penn State on the road. They upset number one Oregon in the quarterfinals. They do lose in the semifinal to Georgia, but it doesn't matter because Iowa is now permanently inside the room. In this what if universe, Iowa never chased power. They just chased certainty. And by refusing to wait, by refusing to assume tradition would protect them, they accidentally became one of the most future proof programs in the sport. Not louder, not flashier, just still standing.